There are places in this world that breathe, not with the air we know, but with a deeper, darker pulse. Ashford Manor was one of those places. To the untrained eye, it was a mansion frozen in time, a relic of a bygone era, its ivy-clad walls and grand windows whispering of forgotten elegance. But there are whispers that go beyond the walls, whispers that call to the lost, to the vulnerable, to the curious. When Claire and James moved into Ashford Manor, they thought they had found their dream home. What they didn't know was that the house had been waiting for them, waiting to claim them, just as it had every soul before them. And as night descended on the manor, the walls would begin to whisper again, louder, closer, until Claire could no longer tell where the house ended, and the horror began. Claire and James had been searching for the perfect home for months, and when they stumbled upon Ashford Manor, they knew they had found it. The sprawling estate was tucked away on the outskirts of town, surrounded by towering trees whose limbs intertwined like ghostly fingers. The house itself was an imposing structure, a Victorian masterpiece with ivy climbing up its stone walls and grand windows that gazed out over the rolling hills. It seemed to hold an air of forgotten elegance, as though it had been waiting for someone to breathe life into it again. The price was shockingly low for such a magnificent property, and though the real estate agent mentioned its age and the fact that it had been empty for decades, he dismissed any concerns with a quick smile and an assurance that the house had been thoroughly inspected. But there was something about Ashford Manor that unsettled Claire from the moment they arrived. A lingering tension in the air, a subtle hum of energy that made her skin crawl. James, ever the pragmatist, laughed off her concerns. "It's just an old house, Claire. Old houses creak and groan. We're just not used to it." But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something in the house was watching her, waiting for her to slip up. The first night was uneventful. They set up the furniture in the grand parlor and explored the vast rooms, each one more exquisite than the last. The kitchen was large and old-fashioned. The dining room with its massive chandelier made them feel like royalty. But as the evening drew on, a heaviness descended on the house. The air grew cold, and the fireplace seemed to be the only source of warmth in the otherwise still and silent rooms. Around midnight, Claire couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring up at the ornate ceiling, her mind racing with unease. The house creaked, groaned, and whispered as if it were alive. Just when she thought she might be imagining things, she heard it. A faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across wood. Claire sat up in bed, her pulse quickening. The sound came again, this time closer, and it was followed by a soft whisper, so faint she could barely hear it. "Claire." She froze, her heart thundering in her chest. She knew James was sound asleep beside her. The voice sounded so real, as though someone had whispered her name directly into her ear. Her hand trembled as she reached for the lamp on her nightstand. But before she could turn it on, the whisper came again, louder this time. "Come. To me." The cold air intensified, and Claire's breath turned to mist. She shot out of bed, frantic, and hurried toward the door, her mind clouded with terror. But when she stepped into the hallway, the house was still. The silence was oppressive, thick like a blanket. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Determined to find the source of the noise, Claire made her way toward the attic, where the sounds had seemed to come from. The stairs creaked under her weight as she ascended into the darkness. The attic door was ajar, an ominous crack of blackness waiting for her. As Claire stepped inside, the air grew even colder, her breath visible in front of her. The flashlight she carried flickered in the gloom. It illuminated a room full of old furniture draped in white sheets, dusty trunks, and forgotten memories. But what caught her attention was the rocking chair in the far corner. It was rocking, slowly and eerily, as if something had just been sitting in it. Suddenly the temperature dropped even further, and Claire felt a cold hand brush against her arm. She gasped and spun around, but there was no one there. Her heart raced, and she hurried to the door, desperate to escape. But as her fingers reached for the handle, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled her bones. "Claire," the voice whispered again, louder, closer, as though it was right behind her. She spun around, flashlight in hand, and what she saw made her blood run cold. A figure stood in the shadows, pale, translucent, with hollow eyes and a twisted, agonized expression. It stepped forward, its feet making no sound on the dusty floor. The figure raised its hand, pointing directly at her, and as it did, the room seemed to close in around her. The air grew suffocating, and the floor beneath her feet seemed to tremble. "No," Claire whispered, backing away, her pulse racing. But before she could escape, the figure's voice came again, more desperate this time, full of anguish. "Help me," Claire screamed as the figure lunged toward her, its cold fingers grazing her skin, sending an icy shock through her body. In a blur of panic, she broke free, slamming the door open and running down the stairs as fast as she could. She didn't stop until she was back in their bedroom, her chest heaving with fear. James awoke to her frantic sobs. "Claire, what's wrong? What happened?" Claire couldn't speak at first. She was trembling too violently. The images of the ghostly figure were burned into her mind. She'd seen something that wasn't alive, but it had been so real, so tangible. James tried to comfort her, dismissing her fears. "You must have had a nightmare. It's just an old house. It plays tricks on your mind." But the following days brought more unexplained events. At night, Claire could hear faint footsteps above her, pacing in the attic, and the whispers continued, each one becoming more insistent. "Come to me. Come to me, Claire." Despite James's reassurances, Claire couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. Something in the house was alive, and it was calling to her. One evening, after another sleepless night, Claire couldn't stand it any longer. She decided to investigate the history of the house, hoping to find answers. She visited the local library, where an elderly librarian named Mrs. Westcott took one look at her and knew exactly what she was searching for. "The Ashford family," Mrs. Westcott said gravely. "That house is cursed. The Ashfords were a wealthy family, but there was darkness in that house. The mother, Margaret, went mad after the loss of her daughter Annabel. She claimed that voices whispered to her from the walls, calling her to join them. One night, she disappeared, and the house has been empty ever since. They say Annabel never left." Claire's blood ran cold. Annabel's name sounded familiar, but she hadn't realized how much the story mirrored her own experiences. The whispers, the coldness, the voices calling her. It all made sense now. When Claire returned to the house that night, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her. The whispers had grown louder, more desperate. She had to confront whatever was haunting Ashford Manor. In the attic, she found the hidden door, just as Mrs. Westcott had described. It was hidden behind old furniture and debris, but Claire managed to open it. The stairs led down into a hidden basement, where the air was thick with decay. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and in the center of the room, there was an altar, a blood-stained altar. And there, sitting in the corner, was Annabel. Her eyes were wide open, her face twisted in silent terror. She had been trapped, her soul bound to the house, a victim of its curse. And now, it seemed, she was calling Claire to join her. Claire tried to flee, but the door slammed shut behind her. The house seemed to close in on her, the walls tightening, the whispers growing louder. She screamed, but no one was there to hear her. In the end, Ashford Manor claimed her, as it had claimed all the others before her. The house stood silent once more, waiting for the next soul to wander into its grasp.